Hi, I'm Geoff Ginter. Welcome to Real Progressives MMT Mondays. This is a new show dedicated to really bringing forward the economic experts so that you can see and hear what they have to say, and hopefully you'll take that knowledge and you'll spread it around. Last week we presented a video that I did. I am not an economist. I am not an expert. I simply wanted to be able to give a framework for the discussion that we're going to be having moving forward. Just a bare bones, basic understanding of what MMT is. Its operational reality that is in existence right now and has always been in existence. And if you understand the monetary system, then you understand that the things that we as progressives want are actually possible and therefore worth standing up and fighting for. We don't need to compromise. But this week we're going to have my favorite video from my favorite MMT economist, Professor Stephanie Kelton. Why is she my favorite? Because she is probably the best communicator of MMT. There are so many, and we're going to bring you a lot. You know, from Randy Ray to Fidel Kabouf, Stephen Hale, Warren Mosler, Ellis Winningham. We're going to bring you a lot. But Stephanie, she really brings it home to me in a very accessible way. So today we're going to bring you Stephanie Kelton's Angry Birds. And at the end of this video, you should really start thinking about the whole economy in a brand new way, in a different way if you haven't already. I encourage you, please, to get more and more people to watch this video, whether they be Republicans, Libertarians, Progressives, Liberals, I don't care. We can all have differences of opinion about policy and about how we're going to treat one another, but none of those differences should be rooted in the scarcity of money, at least not at the federal level. So sit back, take some popcorn, and enjoy Stephanie Kelton's Angry Birds. Thank you very much. See you in the bit.
And tonight she'll be speaking on the Angry Birds approach to understanding deficits in the modern economy. I give you Dr. Stephanie Kelton.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. How's the sound? Are we good? Okay, great. So I'm going to try to walk around, and hopefully this thing does not take on a life of its own again. So thank you very much Wednesday evening for coming out to listen to an economist, of all things, talk about deficits and debt, of all things. And so the way I feel about this is that I'm going to try to do in an hour what really would take several hours to probably make much of a dent in the kind of deeply entrenched thinking that most of us probably have about money and deficits and debt and government's role in the economy and so forth. We are so bombarded on a daily basis with reinforcing messages that end up producing a narrative that becomes the conventional wisdom. And I think most of us reach the point that we no longer question these things. We simply accept them and we assume that they're correct because so many people repeat them. And then a person like me gets up here and starts poking holes in these arguments and ideas and so forth. And it's a lot to try to undo the damage that's been done to us over probably most of our lives on some of these sorts of topics. So let me just say this was one of the more fun talks I have ever put together, this whole Angry Birds thing. I've never done this before, so just putting this slideshow together was a great deal of fun. I'm going to try to work through the arguments pretty quickly in an hour and then leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, okay? But I want to start off by addressing this big question. Why are we so angry about deficits and debt? Okay, so I have a short video, and I don't know if it will work better with the lights dimmed, but I'll leave that to our technical expert here. Here we go.
Taking money from our children and borrowing from China.
To take out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children, driving up our national debt that we are going to have to pay back. That's irresponsible. It's unpatriotic.
The government's irresponsible spending is turning us into slaves. You might well literally lock us into chains, at least our children.
We've got to deal with this big long-term debt problem, or it will deal with us.
And it is
I'm asking you, join us to stop this fiscal train wreck. Join us to protect our children from an inferior standard of living, from a crushing burden of debt and taxes.
Okay, I don't believe in any of the tax cuts. I didn't want tax cuts for the rich. I didn't even want it for the middle class. Okay, because you know why? Because it puts a $400 billion hole in the budget and we just can't afford it.
And as we discuss deficit reduction, which is clearly a major issue.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future.
And the deficit thing is real, and the debt thing is real. We are really in trouble on it at some point.
Is there need for comprehensive deficit reduction? The answer is not only yes, but hell yes.
This debt that hangs over our head, a government that spends more money than it takes in. That's not sustainable.
You cannot cut taxes or increase spending unless you can pay for it.
The math of federal spending does not add up. And we are spending money we do not have.
We have a debt burden that's crushing us.
To me, this is more of a moral issue. It is. You can't steal from your kids and grandkids.
Deficit. We think the deficit and the national debt are at a moral level.
National debt is America's biggest problem.
Okay, so we hear all the time that Washington can't agree on anything. Baloney, right? They definitely agree when it comes to the dangers and the inappropriateness of governments running budget deficits and the resulting dangers associated with a growing national debt or even the existence of a national debt. So it's no wonder that we're angry about these things because everyone's telling us we should be angry. It's immoral. It's burdening the next generation. It's robbing our future, right? It's creating all these sorts of problems that we're going to have to face, making us vulnerable to the Chinese and all these sorts of things. So it's no surprise that we're anxious about these sorts of things, but it's like listening to a bunch of dodos who talk about the economy in a way that if you stop and think about it, really doesn't make any sense at all. Things like saying that we have to eliminate the deficit in order to maintain a healthy economy. They say things like, we hate the national debt, we want to get rid of it, but we love US Treasuries, and we love the fact that we have the safest, most liquid pool of investment opportunities for people who want to hold assets in their portfolios, safe, liquid assets called US Treasuries. You can't want to eliminate the debt and also be proud that there are safe, liquid treasuries because the national debt is that pool of treasuries, okay? They say things like, we have to stop spending to grow the economy. As my colleague Bill Black says, this is an oxymoron invented by regular morons. These are the kinds of things that can't make sense. They can't. They must be wrong. But we don't stop and think about why they must be wrong. We've become accustomed to hearing it, we've accepted it, we no longer question it, okay? And it seems to make sense. I think that's why it's so easy to accept these arguments, because they resonate with us, they make sense. When someone tells you that you should stop spending money you don't have, pay down your debt and balance your budget and save for the future, seems to make sense, right? Because the finances that we're all most familiar with are our own. And so we know that it makes good sense to us as individuals to save for the future, not spend money you don't have. We've seen people who take on too much debt. We know people probably who have filed bankruptcy. We've seen businesses go under. We've seen municipal governments and even some states get into trouble with spending. We know it's important to save for the future. So all that stuff makes sense to us on a personal level. So when somebody says, what's good for the goose, or the geese in this case, is good for the gander, we say, well, sure it would be, right? Because it makes sense. Go to a standard run-of-the-mill personal finance website. They're a dime a dozen. Go to one of these sites like this moneymatters101.com, and you get the same sort of advice over and over. What do they tell you to do? Stop spending money you don't have, balance your budget, control the urge to spend, and pay off your debt. Perfectly sensible advice to give to individuals. The problem is that it's catastrophic advice if everyone in the economy tries to follow it at the same time. How can something that's good for the individual, spending less, saving more, paying down debt, be bad for the economy as a whole? It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense until you stop and think about it. This guy right here is Paul McCulley. Okay? He is the CEO of PIMCO. Oh, sorry, he's the chief economist at PIMCO. This was Paul McCulley after he left PIMCO, grew out the hair, grew the beard, went to the beach, said, I'm out of here, I'm gonna go surfing for a while. And then PIMCO's the world's largest bond fund. Then PIMCO started to go, shoo. So they called Paul, will you come back? He said yes, and so he's back at PIMCO and he's the chief economist there. He goes on Bloomberg and he's talking about this, and he says, saving is good individually, but collectively it kills income. It's good for the individual, but if everybody in the aggregate tries to do it, it hurts the economy. You say, why would that be? Two reasons, okay? One is well known to students of the economy and academics as the paradox of thrift. This is one of Keynes's key contributions. The idea, it's a paradox, it's a puzzle. It has to do with thrift, which refers to being thrifty, saving. So the paradox of thrift is all about how it is possible that if everyone in the economy tries to spend less and save more, the economy ends up spiraling down. You end up not accomplishing the goal in the aggregate. Why? Because when you spend less and save more, you're not buying goods and services that have been newly produced that become part of GDP, which is national income. So income goes down, and when income goes down, people have less income, they do what? They spend less and they save less. And so the process continues in what Keynes called a multiplier fashion, and the whole thing spirals downward. The paradox of deleveraging is similar. It says if everybody tries to spend less and pay down debt, it means we're robbing businesses of customers. They don't have sales because we're trying to pay off our credit cards and our mortgages and service our student loans and so on and so forth. So we're paying down debt instead of buying newly produced goods and services, and it ends up hurting the economy. So McCulley understands capitalism runs on sales. I don't know any simpler way than those 4 words to explain how a modern capitalist economy works. It runs on sales, okay? And what that means is spending creates income. Think about that. One person's spending is another person's income. You leave here tonight, where are you gonna go? Maybe you'll go out, have a beverage, have dessert, have a meal. What are you gonna do? You're gonna pay for it somehow, okay? So you pull cash out of your wallet, you take out a credit card, whatever you're doing, you're spending. And you're spending on some newly produced service in the economy, the meal that you consume, the beverage, right? Spending creates income. One person's spending is another person's income. And income creates sales. My kids are 9 and 7. Okay, they get an allowance. My son spends everything immediately. My daughter saves for a few months and then makes a big purchase, but they spend everything, okay? At some point, they're going to get into high school and they'll get a part-time job and their income will go up a little bit. What are they gonna do? They're gonna spend a little bit more and then they're gonna go to college and God willing, they're gonna get a job after that. And then their income's gonna be higher. What are they gonna do? They're gonna spend more, right? They'll start a family. They'll buy their first home. They'll get a car. They'll do all these things. As they progress through life, their income should increase. And what will happen along with that? They will spend more. Income leads to sales. And at the end of the day, it's sales that create jobs. I know there's lots of discussion about how to create jobs. How do you get jobs in the economy? We're all eager to see robust economic growth, and that means including job creation. How do you get jobs? People say, well, you have to incentivize the job creators. How do you do that? Well, you have to take away the onerous regulations that preclude them from hiring and investing. You have to cut taxes so that they feel better about the world and they go out and they hire and spend into the economy. But at the end of the day, you can deregulate until the cows come home. You can cut taxes until the cows come home. And if the business or shopkeeper opens the door and nobody comes in the showroom, what's going to happen? They're not going to hire and invest. Sales create jobs. Businesses hire and invest when they're swamped with customers. You got to have sales. Otherwise, there's no incentive for anybody to hire a worker or invest in new machines and equipment and so forth, because why would I do that? I don't have demand at the end of the day for the stuff that I want to sell. So this is the driver. It's customers, it's sales that drive job creation, and it's income that results from spending that kicks the whole thing off. I'm afraid that what we've done today, where we are in the national conversation, is that we're trying to make spending the enemy in an economy that runs on sales. Okay, you can't do that. If the goal is to grow the economy, what do we mean, students of the economy? When we talk about the economy, what's our measure? It's GDP. You can't reach out and touch the economy. You can't point to the economy. But when we talk about growing the economy, we're talking about growing our national output, our economic pie, our gross domestic product. And what is our gross domestic product? In words, what is it? It's what? It's the sum total, measured in US dollars, of all the spending that we do buying newly produced goods and services in our economy. So you can't say that we need to stop spending to grow the economy. This is the oxymoron I referred to, right? The economy is the measure of how much money we spend buying the newly produced output in the economy. The only way to grow the economy is to increase spending. There's no other way to do it. It's not a theory, it's not my opinion, it's how we measure GDP. So if you want growing economy, you have to have rising spending. No two ways about it. So when you study economics, and many of those of you in the audience here have done so, often at the principles level, you're faced with a picture, this sort of bathtub image. And it's not a bad analogy. It's a little bit imperfect, but I think it does a pretty good job of focusing attention. So if you think of your economy like this bathtub, you say somewhere in the tub is a line. Okay, you can't see it here, but there's a line inside the tub, and it's marked potential GDP or full employment. Somewhere in the tub is that line. Now, if the goal is to run the most efficient economy you can, to get the most out of your labor and your capital as possible, to reach your full potential, you want to get that water level right up to the full employment line. Anything below that is just inefficient and wasteful. Anything above that risks inflation, risks trying to use too many resources, more than you have capacity for. So the trick to running a healthy economy is really not more complicated than recognizing that you've got a faucet and you've got a drain, and that there are injections, ways to put water in the bathtub, and there are leakages, things that take water out of the bathtub. That bathtub is our GDP, okay? So what are these leakages that take water out of the tub and move us away from our goal? One is saving. Every dollar that we save and don't spend is a dollar that can't be captured by some business trying to sell its output, can't become part of its sales revenue, and ultimately part of its profit. Saving is a leakage, okay? It goes out of the economy. Taxes are a leakage. Every dollar that's taxed away from us by government is a dollar we don't have to spend into the economy. It's a Leakage, it takes water out of the tub. And imports, M there. Every dollar we spend buying goods and services that are produced somewhere else in the world is a dollar that can't be captured by some domestic producer trying to sell their output, and so it leaks out of the bathtub. Okay, this would be a problem. If all we had were leakages, we'd have a huge problem on our hands, but we don't. We have ways to put water into the bathtub. How do we do that? One way is businesses invest in the economy. When we say businesses invest, we don't mean share buybacks and that sort of stuff. We mean plant and equipment, software, research and development, businesses investing and adding to our GDP. So that puts water in the tub. Government spends, okay, places orders with Lockheed Martin and Boeing and so on and so forth, Social Security, all of that. So government is spending into the economy, and as government buys newly produced goods and services, so don't count Social Security there, it is putting water into the bathtub. The rest of the world buys some stuff from us, and we export. That's X. So every time someone in some other part of the world buys our stuff, it puts water in our bathtub. So what you have are these two flows, right? You have water coming in, and you got water going out. And the question is, which is bigger? Are the leakages bigger than the injections? Because if they are, the water level in the tub is going to go down. Think about it. If you pull the drain on your bathtub and you set the water to a trickle, what's going to happen? It's going to go right down the drain. Okay? If you put the water in faster than you're taking it out, the water level is going to go up. So the question is, how do we figure out a way to calibrate these flows so the water level hits the full employment mark, not below because we get unemployment, and not above because we risk running inflation? That's the trick. So right now we have an economy that some days of the week we get economic data out and economists get very excited because the data looks good, looks strong. Jobs reports, manufacturing, consumer confidence, all these things that economists pay attention to. Some days we get a good set of data and we think, okay, looks like the recovery is chugging along. We're going to be all right. Other days we get data that looks not so good, right? And it starts to make us wonder if we are starting to slow down and maybe beginning to approach the point where we move into a recession. So how do you keep the recovery going? You're never going to extend it forever. No capitalist economy on earth has ever eliminated the business cycle. We're going to go down. Eventually, we will have another recession. That's the bad news. The good news is it will most certainly be followed by a recovery. We're going to go like this, presumably forever, because we always have, and so has every other economy like ours on the planet. So how do we get the most out of this recovery? How do we prolong the recovery so that we get the recession later in time? All right? And the answer is we have to make sure there's enough spending in the economy to buy the output so firms don't get disappointed, see their inventories building up, start firing their workers, and scaling back production. There's got to be enough spending. So where's the spending come from? It can only come from three places. It comes from your private sector, all the households and firms in the economy, can come from government, or it can come from the rest of the world. But it can't come from anywhere else. Those are all the sources of demand. What we're doing is killing our customers. And we've got, for all intents and purposes, two political parties, one of whom insists that we face a spending problem, by which they mean we're spending too much. But one person's spending is another person's income. So if you reduce spending, you reduce someone's income, and then sales, and then jobs. So this, I think, moves us in the wrong direction. The other party says it's not a spending problem at all. What we have is a revenue problem, by which they mean we don't collect enough revenue. We should raise taxes. But every dollar taxed away from you is a dollar you don't have to spend on some newly produced good or service, which means fewer sales, which mean harder to get firms to hire and invest. So I think both of these are moving us in the wrong direction. And why? Because we have all these ideas in our head that are outmoded, outdated, inapplicable, but darn it, their convictions behind them are strong. We think the government is just like a household. It's bigger, but basically it's just like we are. It's got to live within its means. It can spend more than it takes in for a time, but ultimately this can't go on forever, right? Eventually, you've got to start living within your means. The only way you can run deficits is if you can find someone who has dollars, who's willing to lend you those dollars on terms that you can afford. So at an interest rate that's reasonable. There's only so much money out there, right? I mean, it's not like it's infinite. So the more people who are competing to borrow dollars, households want to borrow, businesses want to borrow, governments want to borrow, the more intense the competition for that limited pool of dollars, like a pile in the corner of the economy, the higher the price. We bid up the price. This is how we think. There's a fine line between a solvent government and an insolvent one. You could go broke, take on too much debt. Once your debt gets too high, the rating agencies begin to worry. Your creditors worry. Nobody wants to lend to you any longer. Now it's going to cost you more because, it's riskier to lend to you. Your borrowing costs might spike and you could end up like Greece. And we've all seen the images on TV of Greece burning and protesters in the streets and the ugly mess that has taken place there. This is zombie economics. These are zombie ideas. No matter how much we try, they're just nearly impossible to kill. Right? They just keep coming back. So you get an image like this, a picture that makes people angry. I was driving down the road and this was the bumper sticker on the car in front of me on I-70. Somebody put it there for a reason, right? To say, look at this. Drive behind me and stare at this and think about this. Look what we're doing to our country, to our children, to our nation. What have we done? We're shameful, awful, profligate people. Shame on us, right? Makes you mad. But the picture itself has no economic meaning whatsoever. No economic meaning. And yet, a lot of people think it does. And the conversations that take place, Thanksgiving's coming, around the dinner table, there will be political discussions. They're hard to avoid. And people will start talking about this stuff, right? And then the anger starts to spread. And it's really important that we check ourselves and check our thinking so that we're directing our anger. When it's appropriate to be angry, we should be angry. But we should be angry about the right things and not imaginary threats and so forth, like I think we're angry now. So this is really my effort at anger management with you tonight, okay? I want to make sure we don't get angry about the wrong things. So let me invite you to consider a calming fact. This is a statement from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, all right? You figure they should know something about money because they're the Federal Reserve after all. So this is a research paper put out by the St. Louis Fed. And it opens with this sentence. As the sole manufacturer of dollars, whose debt is denominated in dollars, the US government can never become insolvent. Can never become insolvent. That is, unable to pay its bills. In this sense, the government is not dependent on credit markets to remain operational. There will always be a market for government debt because, hey, the government has the only means of creating a safe place to park your dollars, US Treasuries. And people will always choose to put their dollars in a safe place that pays them interest if it's available, right? There will always be a demand for dollars. Hone in on the opening part of that sentence, as the sole manufacturer of dollars. When there is one manufacturer of something, what do we call them? A monopolist. We call them a monopolist. The US government is the monopoly issuer of the dollar. It has granted itself the sole legal authority to create the currency. If you and I get caught doing it in our basements, bad news for us because it's called counterfeiting and it's illegal. We are not allowed to create the dollar. The US government has the exclusive right to create the US dollar. Now, if that is true, and it is true, then how can the US government ever go broke? Ever have a problem affording some program? Ever be turned into Greece, where it's forced to go out and borrow and beg for the currency? It's the monopoly issuer of the dollar. When you play the game Monopoly, and probably nearly everyone in this room has played the game Monopoly, and you open up, getting a little feedback, you open up the rules. And you say, okay, we're going to play Monopoly. Let's all sit down. What's the first thing you do? You set up the cards, and then you say, who's going to be the banker? You have to point to someone. Someone has to agree to be the banker in the game. And then you read on, okay? Collect taxes. No, that's not the first step. Why doesn't the banker collect taxes so they can get the game going? Because nobody has any money yet. So what does the banker first do? It issues some of the money. It has to issue the money before it can collect anything back. The game can't even begin until people have monopoly money to start the game. So the spending, the issuing of the currency, has to come first. Then you read on in the instructions, which I have here in front of me, and they say, besides the bank's, wait a minute, somebody highlighted, here we go. The bank collects taxes, fines, loans, and interest. The bank never goes broke. If the bank runs out of money, the bank may issue as much more as needed by writing on any ordinary paper. It's exactly that's what it means to be the monopolist. That's why they call it monopoly, right? Well, it works, okay? They call it monopoly. There is a monopoly issuer of the currency who has to spend it before it can be collected back. Now look, you start playing the game and you're moving your pieces around the board and you land on the community chest or the chance and you draw your card and it says, uh-oh, pipes burst, pay $50. There goes a leakage. You keep playing, you land on another one. Uh-oh, taxes due, pay $100. Okay, this game will end very quickly if there isn't a replacement for that money that's leaking out. So what happens every time you pass go? You collect $200. Why does the monopoly game tell the banker to put $200 in every time you go around? To keep the game going. To let the game continue for a while, right? You can save in Monopoly. You save in the form of real estate investment. So every time you pay for a house or a hotel, you pay the banker some money, and it's out of the game. It's leaked out. So they're saving. You have taxes. Every time you pay taxes, it's leaked out. Okay, the only thing you don't have that I explained in the bathtub example are foreign imports. Now, you're not importing, but you have the other two leakages, and then you have the issuer of the currency spending back more than it's collecting, or the game will quickly come to an end. Which is to say, if the banker is not deficit spending, the game will end much sooner, right? Whoops. Uh-oh, that is not good. Okay. All right, so let me give you one more expert statement on this, and then I'll let it rest because I'll assume I've convinced you. And this is Alan Greenspan when he is under oath as chairman of the Federal Reserve. He is faced with a question from Congressman Paul Ryan. Now, the question is about Social Security, but it doesn't matter that the question is about Social Security. It could be about defense spending. It could be about education spending. It could be about infrastructure spending. It could be about student debt. It could be about anything. What matters is his answer. Okay, so let me play Alan Greenspan. Recognize that Greenspan is not the clearest speaker in the entire world, so after you listen to him, I will rephrase.
So having personal retirement accounts is another way of making a future retiree benefits more secure for their retirement. And also, do you believe that personal retirement accounts as a component to a system of solvency does help improve solvency? Because when you have a personal retirement account policy, it's accompanied with a benefit offset. With that feature in place, do you believe that personal retirement accounts can help us achieve solvency for the system and make those future retiree benefits more secure?
Well, I wouldn't say that the pay-as-you-go benefits are insecure in the sense that there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to somebody. The question is, how do you set up a system which assures that the real assets are created which those benefits are employed to purchase? So it's not a question of security. It's a question of the structure of a financial system which assures that the real resources are created for retirement as distinct from the cash. The cash itself is nice to have, but it's got to be in the context of the real resources being created at the time those benefits are paid, so that you can purchase real resources with the benefits, which of course are cash.
Okay, so it's funny on a lot of levels, and it's sad on a lot of levels. Clearly, that is not the answer that Congressman Ryan was going for there. His question was, again, don't you agree with me that Social Security is going broke? There's no way the government can make good on all of these promises to future retirees, their dependents, and the disabled. Don't you think, like I do, that now is the time to begin to move toward a system of personal savings accounts, aka privatization? Don't you agree with me, Mr. Chairman? And Alan Greenspan says, no, I wouldn't say there's anything unsustainable about the way the system is set up today, because there's, and I quote, nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. That is a direct quote. So all of you young people who are being told that we can't keep our promises to you, and even people my age, it's only the people who are very close to retirement that they tell, you guys are going to be fine. It's everybody else we can't afford, okay? Because first of all, you vote, and the closer you are to retirement, the louder your voices will be. And they're trying to convince the rest of us, especially the young, by going to campuses with the Kick the Can and Peterson Institute funded stuff and scaring young people so that they don't expect it anyway. So they won't miss it because they never expected to get it. Greenspan is saying there's no reason we can't keep our promises to future generations in full, on time, in perpetuity. We can do it. Then he goes on to make the really important point, the second half of his answer. He says, the question is, will the real assets be there in the future that those benefits are employed to purchase? Quote, what is he saying? He's saying we have demographic changes taking place in the US. We have a shrinking workforce, and we have a growing population of retirees. Why? Baby boomer generation. Right? The baby boomers are retiring. As they leave the workforce, it leaves behind a smaller population of people who are working and producing stuff. So Greenspan's point is, if we are going to be a productive enough society in the future, no worries, because there will be enough stuff for those benefit payments to purchase. If we are not going to be a productive society in the future, we got us a problem, because we're going to have a lot of people wanting to consume things, but we're going to have fewer people working and producing things. That is going to set off competition for a smaller pool of output. And what happens when the competition intensifies and we mail out all these benefit checks? You can get inflation. The risk we face in terms of Social Security is not whether we can afford it in money terms, because he said we always can. We can always write the check. We're the monopoly issuer of the currency. The question is, are we making the kinds of changes today, the sorts of investments that will help ensure that 10, 20, 30 years down the road, we are a productive economy, so when those checks hit the mailbox, or more accurately, the checking account, because it happens electronically, and people get their money, they can go out and buy things without creating inflationary pressure. That's what the whole entire debate should revolve around. It cannot be about affordability. This is Mark Twain. Why don't we talk about this? Why doesn't that question and answer from Ryan and Greenspan run on morning news shows? Why doesn't anybody open that conversation so that we can talk about what really matters? Twain says sometimes it's just easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. Okay, because we believe Social Security is going broke. Everybody says so. It's easier to just sort of go with a narrative and talk about ways to fix it than to actually say, listen, really, in truth, not going broke. What we should be doing is fighting over the best way to increase future productivity. Is it through increased spending on education, infrastructure, innovation, technology, research and development? How do we make sure we're a productive society in the future? That's a conversation we should be having, but nobody's having it. Greenspan's point is simply, if in the future there's not enough stuff and we all want stuff, we're going to fight hard for who gets it. And what we should be doing is stocking the nest with lots of stuff. So there's plenty to go around so we don't get inflation as we bid up prices. Okay, why can't we see any of this? I don't know. I think it's because in our own brains, we haven't worked out yet how money works, where money comes from, and we're convinced that money is finite. There's only so much of it. And so you can't just spend on things because you got to get the money from somewhere. And we're trapped in this gold standard way of thinking where money is a thing, like gold is a thing. And once you spend it, then there's less of it. We don't understand. It's costing us trillions in lost output, lost income, wealth, savings. Every year that we don't run our economy at our potential, we're sacrificing all of the output and income that went with it that could have been earned in the economy, but we didn't produce it, so nobody got it. So we're angry about the debt and the deficit, and we're afraid about burdening our grandchildren. We're afraid of the Chinese, who might one day refuse to give us any dollars, and the bond vigilantes, who might one day go on strike and refuse to buy our debt. We're afraid of all of these threats around us. We've run out of money. We're at the mercy of the Chinese, the rating agencies, bond vigilantes. We're going to end up like Greece or Zimbabwe, Weimar Germany, all this stuff. You hear this, you change the channel on the TV enough times, you're going to hear one or some combination of those arguments. They're all so pervasive. And yet, they're not right. Our monetary system changed fundamentally in 1971. Before 1971, we had an international monetary system that was agreed upon after World War II in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, when 44 countries got together and said, wow, that was harsh. We have to give countries a bit of room. These are war-torn countries. They're going to have to rebuild. We need to provide some sort of stability so that they can rebuild their economies and so forth. Let's fix exchange rates, which means we're not going to have exchange rates, dollars versus pounds versus yen versus Deutschmark, and they're going up and down wildly, and countries can't, without stable exchange rates, consistently buy from the US goods and services to help rebuild their economies because the price is fluctuating all the time. So they said, let's just fix exchange rates, and that'll provide some stability and some certainty, and it'll help in the rebuilding process. 44 countries said yes. 43 of them agreed to fix their currencies to the US dollar. And the US agreed to convert dollars into gold at a fixed price. So it was a fixed exchange rate, gold standard system. And it was in place from 1944 all the way up until 1971 when President Nixon took the US off of gold. Okay? So what I think has happened is that we, especially within economics, the textbooks were written and popularized, especially in the 50s and 60s, Samuelson's textbook. Okay? And those textbooks were written, and the theories were written, and the models were designed for an economy that had fixed exchange rates. And then in the early 1970s, we changed the monetary system completely, but we didn't bother to rewrite the textbooks. So we kept telling the same stories and using the same models and so forth. And it left us thinking that we had less policy space available. Because look, if you're on a gold standard and you're promising to convert dollars into gold at a fixed price, you have to be pretty darn careful about how many dollars you spend into existence, because people might want to convert to gold. And there is only so much gold. So once you start running out of your gold reserves, you compromise the whole monetary system. So we chucked that thing, only we didn't get it out of our heads, and we act as if we are still hamstrung by those same constraints that exist under a gold standard. And the truth is, in the modern era where we are today, we need the federal government to run deficits almost all the time. Okay, and that's really controversial. It doesn't sound fiscally responsible. The deficit hawks definitely do not think this is fiscally responsible. Deficits all the time? What do you mean? The government should never spend a dime more than it takes in taxes. It should balance its budget in every fiscal year. Have a constitutional amendment to ensure that that happens. Extreme fiscal conservative, fiscal hawks. Deficit doves, kinder, gentler deficit birds. Sometimes I refer to them as the mealy-mouthed liberals. These are the guys mostly, let's be honest, who say, well, gosh golly gee, we fundamentally agree with you. Deficits are unfortunate, and we sure would like to avoid them, but sometimes the economy just gets so darn weak that government needs to step in and prime the pump a little bit, right? Rev the gas and run a deficit in the weak period, but as the economy recovers, we want the government's budget in surplus. So over the course of the business cycle, the budget will be in balance. Deficits in weak years, surpluses in stronger years, balanced over the course of the cycle. All right, that is the deficit dove position. I think we need a brand new bird, because the others are not getting us where we ought to be and where we could be, which is at our potential, right? They're holding us back. Why do I choose the owl? Obviously, deficit an owl is very wise. Owls are well known to be able to see in the dark, so they can see things the others can't. Their little heads go all the way around, so they can see stuff the other guys are missing. They can look at the problem from a different vantage point. This is a big advantage, right? Deficit owls want to balance the economy, not the budget. Okay, the priority is just different. What good is a balanced government budget if you wreck your economy to get there? Do you feel good about the fact that the government's deficit has been falling at the fastest pace since the end of World War II? That's a real achievement, not if you have a junky economy, right? So the goal should be balancing the economy. This is a graph using actual US data that just shows the relationship between the government's budget and all of our budgets. It is the balance sheet position of the government on the bottom. Below zero is a deficit, above zero is a surplus. And what it shows, it's not a perfect one-to-one because I left out the foreign sector here, but I think it makes an important and striking point, which is as government deficits get bigger, which means this red line is diving down, that's government going into deficit. But look what's happening above. Private sector's moving way up into surplus. When government deficits fall, go back here. Government deficits fall, almost to balance there. What happens to the private sector surplus? It falls almost to zero. We tend to move in opposite directions. Their deficits help to produce our surpluses. So anybody who's out to attack the government deficit without knowing it maybe is attacking private sector surpluses, which we all know no one in their right mind would support reducing private sector surpluses if they understood that that's what they were doing by championing reduced government deficits. Okay, so an important point is that we're all so used to hearing people say, deficits are too big, deficits are too big, deficits are too big. No one ever suggests that the deficit could be too small. But a deficit owl would recognize that right now, today as I stand here, government deficits have gotten too small. Fiscal year 2014, US federal government's deficit is 2.8% of GDP. This is a graph that's produced by the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. It's a nonpartisan scoring agency. And here the CBO is showing, going back to 1974, how big deficits or surpluses above zero have been since 1974. And all I did was say, I wonder how often we've had recessions over that period of time. So I looked up the dates when recessions start and end over this period of time. And interestingly, every single time, with no exceptions, that the government's deficit gets too small, which here it appears to be below its average of 3.1%, whenever the government deficit gets too small, we've had a recession. Every single time. And where we are today is that question mark. The deficit is back below 3.1%, and I think it's creating drag in the economy that puts us at risk for going back into recession. Okay, it's just accounting. Government deficits are just merely the difference between what the government puts into the economy, think monopoly banker, and what it takes out. So if the government's running a deficit, putting 100 in, taking 90 out, we label it a deficit, and it sounds negative, but we forget that somebody gets that 10. I spend 100 in to the economy. I tax 90 out. I've run a deficit, but somebody's holding the extra 10. That's accounting, okay? So we forget that there's another side to the balance sheet. We focus too much on the government's deficit. Their deficit is our surplus. Their red ink is our black ink. And the game doesn't keep going unless the deficit is big enough to let it continue. So here's Ben Bernanke, right? Here's the question. Well, where is the money going to come from? So Bernanke goes on 60 Minutes, and he's interviewed by Scott Pelley. And Pelley says to him, listen, this Great Recession thing is bad. You folks are spending a lot of money. Is that taxpayer money you're spending? This is a quote. And here's the answer. It's a quote. It's not tax money. We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account. You say, well, you do what? Right? This is the era of modern money. When governments spend, they give instructions to their bank. That guy, well, not anymore, right? The Fed. Hey, we're spending on some new aircraft carriers. Go out and credit the defense contractor's account. And so somebody at the Fed goes like this, and boop, 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 the numbers in the balance sheet go up, checking account go up. We pay our taxes, IRS, $5,000. We're giving instructions to our bank. Take $5,000 out of my account, give it to the US Treasury. Numbers in our account go down, numbers in their account go up. Boop, boop, boop. It's done electronically through instructions, right? Where's the money come from? It doesn't come from anywhere. It comes from the issuer. So what are we getting wrong? We think the government's like a household. It's not. We think the dollar comes from China. It doesn't. It comes from the US. We think the government is revenue constrained, that it can't spend more than it can tax unless it can find someone with dollars, because that's how it works for us. So we're in an environment now where the economy is definitely not fully recovered, and we're cutting taxes and raising taxes and cutting spending and adding to the economic problem. We're afraid to do more because we're afraid of inflation, of China, of bond vigilantes, of Greece, and so on and so forth. I can't address all of those in a short talk, but we look at this national debt clock and it makes us panic, right? Because 17, that's a lot of numbers, 17 and a whole bunch. And so big numbers are scary, and big negative numbers are really scary. And so we get angry about this, but we don't recognize that all that clock is telling us, really the only information it's giving us, is how many times the government has added more than it's subtracted into the economy and allowed those with dollars to convert some of their dollars into a different kind of IOU that pays interest, US Treasuries. The national debt is a national treasure, as one former president once said, right? All of that is somebody's asset. You talk about paying off the national debt, it means eliminating people's assets, 17 trillion of them, safe assets, liquid assets, risk-free assets. Anybody who manages money for a living knows that you want some of this stuff in your portfolio because it helps you diversify risk. You eliminate the national debt, you take away one of the most important tools for diversification. So we've got government now across the board spending cuts, tax increases, leaving people with less money to spend in an economy that runs on sales, adding too much drag to the economy before we get to full employment. So we got 24 million or so Americans who want full-time work and can't find it. There are only about 4 million jobs available. So we have all kinds of slack in the labor market. We have lots of useful things for people to do. We waste a lot of time playing Angry Birds, which somebody has calculated translates into $1.5 trillion in lost wages and so on and so forth, right? It's a silly little exercise, but there are more substantial and meaningful exercises like this one that says the blue line is where we could be. It's our potential GDP as a nation. If we were running our economy at our full potential, we'd be up there on that blue line, but we're not. We're way below our potential, which is that red line. And the difference between where we are and where we could be is all the lost output and all the lost income that adds up over time to trillions and trillions of dollars. So there's a way to measure those sorts of losses. We could be doing useful things, right? We've got infrastructure that's dilapidated, falling down. The civil engineers tell us we should spend $3.6 trillion to repair ports, bridges, water treatment facilities, schools, hospitals, national parks. The whole of our national infrastructure is given a grade of a D+ by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And we're told we ought to spend $3.6 trillion to get it up to snuff. We could do that. We got tons of people who are out of work who have mechanical skills, right? Manufacturing, construction, and so forth. We could do that. We could enhance retirement schemes instead of attacking them, undermining them, and trying to weaken them to cut benefits and so forth. We could make it safer, more secure, more generous. We could do that. We could deal with climate change. But the question now is always, how are you going to pay for it? And we've answered that question. We could help students deal with student debt. Many people believe there's a crisis with student debt in this country. Now, student debt has surpassed credit card debt. There's over $1 trillion of student loan debt out there. There are lots of politicians who, well, not lots, there are some politicians who are working to promote legislation to help alleviate student debt burdens. There's even a movement to strike the debt. There are ways that we can help young people who are struggling with student debt, who, as a result of all that student debt, are postponing household formation. They're living at home longer, so they don't get their first apartment, they don't marry, they don't get their first home. They're starting everything later, and it's delaying a lot of spending in the economy. That's got a lot of hedge fund managers, quite frankly, and others, quite worried about future consumption and how robust the economy is going to be going forward because of the student debt. We're hearing a lot about inequality, right? If since 2009, when the US officially left recession and went into recovery, okay, we're in recovery mode. Output is growing, income is growing. 90% of all the income gains over that period of time since 2009, 90% has gone to the top 10%. Within that category to the top 1%. Within that category to the top 0.1%. And within that category to the top 0.01%. if we continue to distribute the income gains in this way, where the income is going to those who are least likely to and most likely to, and especially save in the form of, well, no, they like real estate and stocks and stuff like that, right? And so they buy assets. And this tends to push asset prices higher, which has a lot of folks, including Janet Yellen, worried that the Fed has been creating bubbles, asset price bubbles. And the problem with bubbles is that it's nice to ride a bubble up, but when the bubble pops, there's a lot of collateral damage, okay? So you're hearing a lot. We could address income inequality. We could institute a federally funded job guarantee program modeled on the WPA, the CCC, the National Youth Administration, the New Deal programs. Raise incomes from the bottom up. That addresses inequality. People talk about a basic income guarantee. You hear a lot about that now. Just give everybody money, right? No matter how much money you have, we'll give you money too. Everybody gets a check. It's Oprah. You get a check, and you get a check, and you get a check. But Bill Gates gets a check. Everybody gets a check. The problem with that scheme is that while it gives more income to those at the bottom, it gives the same amount to everyone else. So it's a ratcheting up of everyone, which does nothing, of course, to deal with inequality. But if you focus on those at the bottom, the unemployed, the least skilled, and so forth, and you guarantee employment with benefits and so forth, you're lifting incomes for those at the bottom and reducing inequality. So there are just lots and lots of things we can do. And if we don't do them, and we continue to have government pull back its contribution, the only way we're going to keep this economy going, the only way the game is going to continue and the pieces are going to go around the board is if we have bubbles, because bubbles work for a while. The problem is that eventually they pop. Debt, we can have the private sector leverage back up. They did this in the late 90s, mid-late 90s and into the 2000s. We borrowed like crazy. We took the equity out of our homes. We borrowed against perceived increases in wealth because stocks were booming and so forth. We can drive this thing with private sector debt for a while. The trouble is that too tends to end badly. We could focus on trade with the rest of the world. Say, well, we're just going to dig ourselves out of this by reversing our trade deficits. We just need a weaker currency here at home. And you try all this sort of stuff. These are not good solutions. There's a better way to do this, but we've got to get the thinking right. We got to get the thinking right. And so it's okay to have differences. It's okay to have parties who disagree about the proper role for government, priorities, spending versus taxing, but we want the disagreements to move in the right direction. We don't want them to say, we need higher taxes and less spending. We want them to fight over whether to have lower taxes or more spending. That would be at least a debate that was moving in the right direction. So it's not that we all have to think exactly the same way, but if we get the thinking right, somewhere in the middle, we might end up okay. So I know that was probably a little longer than y'all thought you were going to dig in for tonight, but thank you for turning out. And I think if there's interest, we could do a short Q&A. And then there's some information here that you could follow up with our sponsors, the Jobs Now Coalition, the Economics Club. There's a little bit of information about the website I run and so forth. So thank you very much.
Thanks for your work. Who and which audiences are you talking to that are getting this? Are there any particular political leaders or key business leaders that this is starting to soak in with?
You know, what's ironic is that the group that has been the most interested consistently and receptive to this, believe it or not, is the financial community. And if you think about it, it's not so surprising. I mean, this is a group of people who do best when the economy does well and the market is doing well. Okay, so I don't think it's that much of a surprise. It's also the community that placed a lot of bets that went very bad. So they looked at what the Fed was doing and said it's going to be inflationary. And they positioned themselves in terms of their financial bets for heightened inflation in the future, and it didn't happen. They saw the government deficits explode, and they said, oh, rising deficits mean higher interest rates. I'm going to make a bet on that, and it didn't happen. And just go on. They looked at what happened in Greece, and they said the U.S. is at risk of default, right? I'm going to bet on that. And it didn't happen. And so they discovered this school of thought and said, okay, these guys have consistently made contrarian calls and been right on these big things. Get them in here. And so, well, I'm not going to say because I think the cameras are rolling. I won't tell you who it was, but it's one of the biggest investment banks in the world. After I gave a very small private talk at the 21 Club in New York for a group of high-level finance types, I get the text message at 12:31 a.m. So-and-so wants to send a car for you at 8 in the morning. We want you here. So it's reached that level. Now with politicians, it's interesting because I've also gone to Washington and sat in the offices of some U.S. members of Congress, both the Senate and the House, and you sit and you go through some of this and you try to do it at a level that they can follow. And so you go through this and it takes a long time and they look like they're in a fog. But then when the light bulb moment happens, the aha moment, you can spot it. You know exactly when it happens. And they typically, here's what happens. They clasp their hands and they say, I can't say that. I can't say that. So you can see it, right? They get the argument, they understand, and they can't say that, right? And my answer is always the same. Well, you don't have to say it. I'm not saying you got to go out there and do what I'm doing, but it'd be nice if you voted as if you understood, right? That you don't need to raise taxes or cut spending in order to balance budgets, and this is the wrong goal. We ought to focus on macro outcomes, objectives, right? But the politics, you saw that opening. Where's John Kraychek? He's a PhD student in our program. That video that I opened with, he put that together in my macro theory class last fall, and it's terrific. It is so terrific. You don't run for office by not pandering to those fears, and so it's a real problem. But I do audiences, community groups. Everyone I do this for has been so positive. I mentioned in Overland Park today, there were 200 people there, and there was an outpouring at the end of it. People, and this is a conservative group, mind you, that is accustomed to thinking in terms of, my clients have savings, and that's good because I want to invest their money. So I like the idea very much that people don't spend everything that they save and pay down debt because that's my bread and butter. And you go in and tell them, yeah, but it's not good if everyone does that. And they go, uh-huh. But they get it, and they had a very positive reaction. It's just that there are too few people doing it.
So what's your analysis of Governor Brownback's economics?
So I got this question today, interestingly, and I told him that I would send him a link to the talk that I gave. Was it here or? No, it was at the Kansas City Public Library a month ago, right? The Jobs Now people sponsored that one as well with the Show Me Institute. And I talked about this. So Kansas is not the federal government. Kansas is a user of the currency, just like all of us are. They're not the issuer of the currency. So you do depend on revenue in a way the federal government doesn't. And when you go out and you slash taxes and revenue dries up and you're constitutionally bound to balance your budget, then what do you have to do? Well, your revenue has dried up, so now you have no choice but to cut spending to balance the budget. And so it's economic madness for a state to do what Kansas did, which was all supposed to be supply-side, trickle-down stuff. You cut taxes, and then everybody comes rushing to your state to take advantage, because as we all know, what's holding all businesses back is burdensome taxes. And if you just get rid of those, then the jobs will come pouring down. And of course, that didn't happen. So I'm not sure it was a calculated error. It might just have been exactly what he hoped would happen. but it's definitely bad for the Kansas economy.
Do you see the movement to increase the minimum wage is going hand in hand with your theory?
I'm not sure I have a theory. What's my theory? I tried to focus mostly on, well, okay, I did do a little bit of theory. The increase in minimum wage going with my theory, do you mean that it increases income and that leads to increased spending? And yes, I do. Yes, I do. And there's lots and lots of empirical research that's consistent with that idea.
Hi, I had a question about the federal guaranteed jobs that you spoke to. My question is, what makes, or what evidence is there that the people would continue to produce at a good level? Like if I have a guaranteed A in a class, I'm not going to do anything. So, I mean, generally speaking, I wouldn't go to class if I was guaranteed an A. So why would somebody who's guaranteed a job produce or try to improve themselves or, you know, help the company out?
Okay, well, that's a good question. So first, they're not necessarily working for a company. These can be jobs, and some of our faculty in the economics department here have written lots and lots about this. So you could read some of Professor Forstatter's work, for example, if you're interested. But the job guarantee doesn't mean you're guaranteed a job, we'll send the check, you do what you want. It doesn't work like that. It is, workers are required to show up, and they're required to work, and they're required to be there on time, and records are kept, and you can be fired from your job. It is a guarantee in the sense that the government is saying, if you are ready, willing, and able to work, and you cannot find employment elsewhere in the economy, we will find suitable work for you at a minimum level of pay. Okay? So you show up and you're a screw off and you're not performing and so forth, that is recorded, and after some number of times, bye-bye. Now you're out. And you won't be hired back into the program. And so you're living on zero instead of living on whatever the basic wage is in the program. So that's your disincentive, the risk of being unemployed with no income. Just like it is now, right? It's no different.
In the hopes that this message would get out further, is there any plans, or have you considered doing this into a TED Talk?
That's a good question. I've been, years ago, someone nominated me. There's a process. You can self-nominate, which is not sort of me, or you could be nominated by someone. And somebody did write a really nice nomination. I don't know how the process works. I'd love to do one. Like, I'd love to do a TED Talk. Bill Black did one. Professor Black did one here, but it's a baby TED Talk. You know, they do little ones, and then they do the big kahuna. I want the big kahuna. I don't know, but I'm certainly willing to do it. Waiting for that phone call.
What are some things that we as voters can do to educate our fellow constituents so that politicians aren't afraid to, when you talk to them about it, they said, oh, well, we can't talk about that or we can't vote that way. How can we help convince other voters
I get that question
this is a good thing?
All the time. It's an excellent question. And, you know, it was FDR who said, I can't do anything, you have to make me do something. That's how I feel. It does none of us any good, I think, to have me continually back and forth to DC. I think the pressure has to mount from the ground up. It's why we launched the blog now almost 6 years ago. It's why we're so active, some of us as faculty, in insane ways, you know, using social media to attract attention. And it has worked. It has worked surprisingly well in the sense that we can get on Twitter now and say something and have the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or the folks at The Economist or Business Insider pick it up, write about it, call us on the phone. And the more that our stuff appears in their outlets, which are much bigger than ours, there's that network effect, and then it reaches new people. And you know, I feel like it's going to take a lot of time, and the more people who are contributing, I know there are dedicated people all over the world starting their own little blogs and writing and trying to spread these ideas. But I think that ultimately we're going to have to reach a critical mass where somebody talks with some politician who says, yeah, we'd love to help, but we're out of money. And there are enough people in the room shouting them down and pointing at them saying, don't give me that nonsense. I know where the US dollar comes from. It's not China. So don't tell me you can't afford it. Tell me you don't want to spend on it. Tell me you don't believe in the increased spending on education. Tell me you don't believe in it. Tell me it's not part of your values, but don't tell me there's not enough money. So it's going to take a while to get there.
2 more questions. If you were dictator for the day and could make one fundamental change in our country and our monetary system, what would you do? Would it be a constitutional amendment? Would it be 0% interest rates or negative interest rates? Is there something that would be big like the gold standard that you would recommend?
If I were dictator for a day, what one policy would I institute? Is that the, yeah. It would, for me, it would have to be the federally funded jobs program. It is transformational. There are lots of things that we can do to try to incentivize employers to hire workers, but you will never, ever, ever achieve true full employment in the economy. So we make up definitions of full employment that aren't really full employment, like natural rates of unemployment. Well, we have a Federal Reserve whose job it is to hike interest rates when too many people are getting jobs. They see people getting jobs and it's happening too rapidly and they say, uh-oh, the labor market is getting tight. Better stop that, right? So they raise interest rates to try to make sure enough people stay unemployed to keep the labor market with enough slack to allow workers to not have stronger negotiating power so that wages go up and inflation goes up. So we have actually institutionalized unemployment. There are always going to be millions of Americans who are not allowed to work, despite their willingness and desire to participate. And the federally funded jobs program eliminates that. Okay? Everyone who wants to participate, who wants to contribute, gets to do so, and they get an income. And they can't be shut out by the Fed or anybody else. So that's what I would do.
Nice question.
A little bit different kind of question. The President and Congress will be voting on what we call a TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's sort of like a treaty. Is it going to be part of the faucet or the drain?
That's a good question. I guess it's going to be both. It's going to be both because, you know, you've got us selling to the rest of the world, that's exports, that's the faucet, and then you've got us buying from the rest of the world, and that's the drain. So, you know, I haven't studied closely the TPP, but I know people like Dean Baker and Eve Smith, Susan Weber, who goes by Eve Smith and blogs at Naked Capitalism. They've written tons about this, and in fact, they did an appearance together on Bill Moyer's show and had a whole show about the Trans-Pacific Pipeline. And it is anything but a trade deal. I mean, it is not about jobs. It is not about trade fundamentally. So there's going to be something happening both on the drain and the faucet. On balance, who benefits? I mean, we're pushing pretty hard for it. So you got to believe that we at least believe it's in our interest. Well, a financial interest, not real trade interest. It's in the interest of, I think it has more to do with patent protection. This is Dean Baker's argument. So it has more to do with protecting US corporations and their ability to earn money and have patent protection and so forth. So it's in our interest, their narrow interest, but it's not so much a trade deal at all.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for coming.
Stephanie.
Okay, so that was Angry Birds with Stephanie Kelton. What did you think? You know, do you start thinking about things in a different way? Does it blow your mind? Is it making you fundamentally change how you personally think the economy works? Do you still think that the federal economy is the same thing as your personal economy? Do you still think that the federal budget should be balanced like your budget should be balanced? If you do, why? Let us know. We'd love to have that conversation. But just remember, if you did pay attention, if you did watch the whole video, just remember there's an order of operations to federal budgeting. First, you have to set your priorities, which is quite honestly what I would rather we call it. Instead of a budget, I would like to see it be a list of priorities. But set your priorities. What do you want to accomplish? What is the goal? In single-payer healthcare, is the goal to make sure that everyone gets healthcare and to make sure that it is not for profit, so that all medical decisions are made from a medical perspective, not from a financial perspective. That way we get a healthy population. So set that as your goal. Then look to your resources. Do we have what we need right now to get this done? If we do, great. The federal government spends and those priorities become reality. If we don't have the resources already set to go, the question becomes, can we mobilize? Can we marshal our resources to get these things? If the answer is yes, then the federal government spends on that and mobilizes those resources so we can get there sooner rather than later, because in the case of healthcare, people are dying. Tick, 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 cluck, cluck, cluck. If we don't have the resources domestically, then we have to ask, can we import these resources from other countries? Remember, we are a net importer. We not only benefit from the resources we have domestically, but also from whatever the rest of the world wants to sell to us. So we have vast amounts of resources to be able to accomplish whatever we want. But that's how a federal government budget should be run. Set your priorities, look to your resources, marshal them as needed, then make your payments. You don't collect taxes first and then decide what you want to do with whatever you're able to get away with getting. Taxes come afterwards. So we're going to get deep into policy next week. I hope to see you there. Bye-bye.